Okay, so this is the second part of the presentation on the independent sector. And we're continuing with the private sector, then we'll move on to the voluntary sector after that. The sector is growing. Okay, I maybe mentioned that in part one. Really, it's been growing. The private sector involvement in delivering mainstream healthcare has been growing since the 1990s. However, when you think about the rationale of it, if you think the NHS can deliver a decent service for free in relation to whatever particular need that you have, there's not really much reason then to look towards the private sector. However, some people look at the private sector for a couple of reasons, really. They tend to offer specialist services, which may be associated with particular lifestyles. But if you have, or you foresee you're going to have, say, a particular condition, and the waiting time in the NHS may be actually very long to have that condition treated, some people may see it as a way of actually getting ahead of the queue. So you pay, for example, your private health insurance, and it means you're going to get your operation much more quickly than being on a 1 year or 2 year waiting list. The NHS, through the trusts, offer a much broader service than the private sector. Often dealing with more complex needs, and more complex needs tend to be more expensive needs. And remember, always should be the back of your mind thinking of the private sector is that these are businesses, and this is for profit. The NHS is obviously free at the point of delivery, and to a certain extent, cost isn't entirely relevant, although we know actually in reality that sometimes some services aren't offered because they are too expensive. But the NHS offers a much more diverse range of services. The increasing use of the private sector to deliver health and social care has engendered quite a lot of debate. You see here on this slide talking about economic, political and ethical debate. They're all actually interlinked, and I'll talk you through them. Firstly, the NHS is free. It's free at the point of delivery, although it's only free to the extent that we actually pay for it ourselves through our national insurance contributions. We have private sector working with the NHS. They're obviously working for a profit, and some people say, well, if we're already paying into the welfare state, and particularly into the National Health Service, where it's not for profit, should that money then be being used to be given to private sector companies who are working for profit? And the suspicion is that actually we're not getting as much value for our money. But the NHS is not trying to create a profit. The private sector is, and if they're being subcontracted or contracted to provide NHS services, one of the considerations will be, well, is this actually costing us more money? Because these are private sector companies and they want to make a profit. This is also a political issue. Traditionally, the NHS, and from its inception, was run by the state. It wasn't run for profit. It was part of the welfare state, from cradle to grave protection and welfare provision for all citizens. Within the UK, there's obviously been quite a lot of debate and quite a lot of heated debate on whether the NHS should then move to a model whereby a significant number of the suppliers are actually doing it for profit, because it runs contrary to the original idea of the welfare state and the original idea of the NHS. The ethical considerations are again linked, very specifically, and you can mention this in your assignment, and we're going to be talking about ethics quite a lot next week. But if somebody can't afford to use the private sector, there we've got an ethical problem. In relation to the NHS, we're all offered the same treatment, well, based on our geographical area. It doesn't matter how much money we have. If it comes to using the private sector independently of the NHS, as in you have to pay for it yourself, whether it's through private health insurance or anything else, that gives us an obvious ethical consideration in relation to justice. Is it just that some people can actually jump the queue for an operation because they can afford to pay for it and other people can't? But we'll look at that in a bit more detail next week. So coming to the end of looking at the private sector, we're going to look at the strengths, and then we're going to look at some of the weaknesses of the sector. One of the arguments in favour of private sector provision of health, and really in provision of anything else, is that it offers greater choice. So you work hard, you earn your money, And people say, well, why shouldn't you decide where you want to go for your treatment? You might think that the private sector are going to offer better treatment. If you can afford to pay for it, well, then you've got the choice to do so. As I mentioned in the previous set as well, it is one of the strengths of the private sector that people usually reference is the fact that you may get treated more quickly. There's less pressure basically on their services because less people are using them. So take the obvious example people use about our waiting times for certain operations. You can maybe have the operation done within the private sector within a couple of months, whereas you may be on an NHS waiting list for a couple of years. It can provide greater flexibility as well. Think about these as businesses who are trying to accommodate you. The NHS obviously is moving towards more and more accommodation of people and their lifestyles. The NHS ethos, however, is slightly different than the private sector. The private sector are looking at you more as a consumer, a customer, and that then filters into how they go about doing their work, and that leads, at least in theory anyway, to them being more flexible to your needs. One of the other strengths is that it's an often more pleasant environment, and you will hear anecdotal stories of people saying that when you do use if you use a private sector hospital, say, even if you're referred from the NHS or whatever else, that actually your physical surroundings are actually nicer. It's cleaner. You know, you might have a vase of flowers in your room, you might have a nice TV in your room or something like that. Another idea is that it allows people to spend their money as they wish, and that takes us back to what I was talking about in relation to greater choice. One of the arguments is simply, if you work, it's your money. If you want to spend it on your healthcare to go private, then that's entirely your decision. Now, that's quite an argument which can become quite involved, and I'll maybe mention a bit more about that when I'm looking at the next slide. But it's one of the arguments as well that people use who are generally in favour of the private sector, whether it's in relation to health or anything else. If you earn the money, you should be allowed to spend it as you wish. So we'll finish the second part of this presentation on the independent sector by looking at the limitations of the private sector. And in the next presentation, or perhaps two, we'll look at the voluntary sector. The first point here is a very standard criticism or concern when people consider the role of the private sector in delivering services that have usually been delivered by the state. It's this idea of an emphasis on profit and how that might affect standards. Some people say it's inherently wrong for people providing care to, by definition, vulnerable people who are doing so for profit. And they would say there's a number of ways that standards may slip when profit comes into the equation. So consider perhaps staff who are not well enough trained, because training costs money. Staff who may be underpaid compared to people doing the same jobs in the public sector. And some people would argue that these things will have an impact on the standard of care being offered. You can consider health insurance. The argument as well that perhaps people may not be offered health insurance if they have underlying conditions, if their family have hereditary conditions as well, which from an ethical point of view is very problematic. I consider as well some of the undercover investigative journalism pieces we've seen recently of people in care homes, and you have staff who essentially are abusing service users, possibly because they haven't been trained to deal with those service users, because they should never have been employed in the first place, or they're very, they're relatively underpaid and they just sort of, they don't really care or whatever else. Another argument against the use of the private sector is that it's expensive. It can be expensive for the state to subcontract out to the private sector. It can also be expensive for an individual if you want to avail of the services being offered by the private sector. Not everybody can afford it. This is obviously a ethical issue as well. You can click on these following two links when I send you the PowerPoint, or you can just look for it on Canvas. It's possible, that the private sector might be less reliable. Businesses that are set up for profit are under pressures that, for example, the NHS isn't. The NHS doesn't need to expand and take risks because there's no rationale to do that, because they're not doing it to make more of a profit. If you have, say, the example we have here of somebody in charge of 58 different care homes, they have business models which are very different than that of the NHS, and they will take risks, and then by extension they may be less reliable. They can go bankrupt, they can get into trouble, and then the service they offer may have to be withdrawn. There's also an argument that they may not be as well regulated as the public sector. In theory, they should be as well regulated. And for example, quite a few years ago, when private sector companies took over residential care for the elderly, to a certain extent, it was seen that they weren't actually offering a very good service, and a lot of regulation had to be rushed through Parliament to actually regulate them. But there is still the argument that it's actually more difficult to regulate the private sector than it is the public sector, and obviously you want organisations like the RQIA to be doing their inspections. You want to make sure that standards are as high as they have to be. There are benchmarks that have to be met. One of the arguments is that it's more difficult to ensure these benchmarks are met within the private sector compared to the public sector.